on our Masters in Executive Coaching. This webinar is part of a series of events we organized here with the Ashridge Centre for Coaching. Just to give you a bit of a context, the Ashridge Centre of Coaching is an internationally recognized centre of excellence in the field of executive coaching, a leading innovator and a provider of standards for the profession of coaching. Its aims has been to build bridges between science and practice. Its research has informed our coaching qualification, a postgraduate certificate, a postgraduate diploma and a master's in executive coaching, a postgraduate diploma in organizational supervision, and also our own executive coaching practice. This is a short introduction, and now I will hand over to Simon.
Well, welcome everyone. It does feel rather odd to be relating to a green light, but let's just see how this unfolds. So my intention is to share some thoughts with you and some perspectives on the nature of coaching and some of the challenges that we and our clients might face when experiencing heightened degrees of uncertainty and complexity. And there will be time at the end for questions, and we're going to try and do that in a way, hopefully, that's a little bit more relational, in the sense that Cy Timmis, who is in the background managing all the technology, is going to invite you, those of you who want to ask a question, if you go into the chat and put your hands up where it says raise hand, Simon will then be able to respond to people, we hope, in the order in which hands are raised. And then you can ask your question live and I can respond to you live, rather than just talking to a lot of disembodied questions typed into the chat. So fingers crossed with that. So there's quite a lot that I would like to cover. Time might determine that we curtail the presentation slightly, because I do want to make sure that there are questions, there's time for questions. So just moving into beginnings really, and framing what this webinar is about, and to help us to sensitize to the territory of uncertainty and complexity in the context of coaching. I find this quote from the Belgian neuroscientist and management writer Theo Compenol very, very evocative of the territory that we're in. So he talks about the linear causal model, which most of us have been taught to think in, is nevertheless very useful as long as one is aware of its limitations and never forgets that this kind of linear cause and effect relationship doesn't actually exist, but it is our way of simplifying a much more complex reality. So what he's saying there is that how we experience reality moment by moment, how we think about our experience, is always a reduction. It's always a simplification of a lot more that is going on in the world and in ourselves, and that's necessary for our functioning in the world. And really what I want to talk a little bit about in this webinar is what happens to our coachees and what happens to us when we are challenged, shaken out of our reliance on this linear causal model and on simplification. And the current pandemic is a tragic way for us all to be really learning a lot and observing a lot of what can happen when people are shaken out of their familiar habits and routines. So in this slide, and there are a lot of words here, if the slides are a bit overwhelming, you might give yourselves permission to just close your eyes or look away and just listen to my voice and what I'm talking to. Just adjust your learning style as best you can in these circumstances. But COVID-19 has shaken us all to varying degrees out of our familiar habits and routines. But for those of us working with a relational orientation and in the field of complexity, the world has been shifting for quite some time. It's whether or not we choose to think of it in those terms. So I wanted to give a flavor in this slide of some of the shifts that have been happening in the world and also in the worlds of work and organizations that many of our clients and senior leaders are, whether they're conscious of it or not, are likely to be being impacted by. So assumptions about the world being predictable and controllable are giving way to seeing the world and recognizing that the world is actually complex and dynamic and unpredictable, which has spawned the acronym that many, or probably all of you, will be familiar with, of VUCA, standing for volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. Ideas about leadership, which have been based for a long time on assumptions about being able to control the world based on science, knowledge capital and technique and the use of best practice, are giving way to thinking of leading as a dynamic process, a process requiring leaders to respond fluidly to challenges and unforeseen events. It involves skill and technique, which can be learned, but it's crucially influenced by what I'm calling here the personhood of individuals. And by personhood, I'm just referring to the whole person who is a leader. So their emotional life, their histories, their personality styles, their relationship to anxiety, their ability to balance their needs for activity and for restoration and recuperation. The idea of leaders as experts, heroes and messiahs is giving way to seeing leaders as these whole people who are human influences in systems of interpersonal interaction. Problems, which have tended to be thought of in the linear paradigm as complicated but nonetheless solvable with enough appliance of science, they're revealing themselves to be wicked, much more convoluted, where we can't see the relationship between cause and effect. And what these kinds of problems require is ongoing vigilance on the part of ourselves and our leaders, the willingness to experiment, reflect on the impacts of our experiments, and then adapt to new data as it emerges. You'll all be familiar with the metaphor of organizations as machines, where workers are seen as human resources, doers, units of capital, where the role of leadership and management is to act upon those units, to direct them and orchestrate activity. Whereas now, from a complexity perspective, we think of organizations more as complex and dynamic processes of human interaction, where meaning is made in relationships and in dialogue. Here, workers are seen as sentient beings who have psychosocial needs, as well as human vulnerabilities, and that they need to be related to and collaborated with, rather than controlled and manipulated. And finally, purpose is evolving from ideas about the purpose of organizations being to serve the agendas of atomized individuals who are split off from one another and who group in elites and subgroups, to really expanding our view of purpose, extending it beyond organization and industry boundaries, recognizing that leadership and purpose inevitably, whether we're intentional or not, have impacts on the whole. And Simon Weston has coined the phrase eco-leadership, which captures this sense of leaders influencing way more than their areas of direct influence, but the planet as a whole. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about the impact of these shifts and some of the things that I've been seeing in my coaching clients over the years, and that I've had to address in myself as in my own ongoing development as a practitioner. So we and our coachees are increasingly faced with what in the context of vertical development are sometimes referred to as disorienting dilemmas. These are the experiences where we feel taken out of our depth, where our current knowledge and past knowledge that we've relied on and the strategies that come from that aren't working. They're either suboptimal, they're less effective than they have been in the past, or they simply aren't fit for purpose. We have to contend with our certainties, the things that we believe to be true and hold on to be true. We have to deal with them becoming less certain, dissolving, as it were, and also are experiencing a loss of identity to the extent that our identities might have been based on ideas about control and expertise. We are all experiencing moving from what we took to be or imagined to be known to the unknown. And all of this, as you will know, can contribute to having an effect on how our nervous systems work, leading to an amygdala hijack, which is how our nervous systems have evolved to respond in the face of actual or perceived threats to our physical well-being, but also to our psychological continuity. And faced with shifting identities and a dissolving of certainties, our nervous system can respond by moving into fight or flight or freeze responses, all of which affect our ability to process information and to stay thoughtful, to keep perspective, and to reflect in the face of these challenges. And I wanted to end this slide with a quote from a long-standing client of mine who many, many years ago came with this dilemma to coaching, where she said, in this role, I never know all I need to know to make the right decision. I can never know all the impacts of my choices and actions, including the bad ones, but not acting is not an option. And I remember being really catapulted out of my comfort zone when she brought that dilemma, because I was still very identified with being a coach who could help and who could help clients find their answers. And I was pretty overwhelmed. So a lot of what I'm talking to today is based on my own experience of responding to some of these dilemmas and working things out together with my clients. And one of the phenomena that really makes itself known in the face of uncertainty is the experience we have of anxiety, which is connected in parts from a neuroscience perspective to the amygdala hijack. And neuroscience is demonstrating increasingly the relationship between actual and perceptions of uncertainty and stress and anxiety responses. And I wanted to talk a little bit about two types of anxiety, because I think I found this distinction very helpful with a number of my clients. And that's the difference between neurotic anxiety and existential anxiety. By neurotic anxiety, what I'm pointing to is the anxiety that we experience in the face of a loss of control, actual or perceived. And it's the type of anxiety that tends to lead us to try harder to restore control. And often for our clients and their organizations, that means doing more of what we've always done, but expecting a different result. It's just we'll do more of it, we'll try harder and hope for the best. So it maintains us in a cycle of repeating old patterns because they're familiar. And that's another way of attempting to hold on to a sense of the familiar. Contrasting that with existential anxiety, this is the anxiety that the existential philosophers talk about, that we experience in the face of a loss of meaning. When we face into meaninglessness and what's sometimes called the void in existential language. And it's the anxiety that we have to learn to be able to bear and live with and regulate in ourselves in order to be able to restore our capacities for meaning making. I want to say I've already talked a little bit about identity, and uncertainty can pose a threat to our sense of continuity and identity, who we take ourselves to be in the world. This is partly because, and I'll say more about this in a moment, this is partly because we often identify, which is a psychoanalytic idea, we identify with the content of our minds. We take ourselves to be our thoughts. We take ourselves to be the images we hold in our minds of who we are, how the world works, and our place in it. So if some of our identity is based on ideas such as I can be in control, I can sort this out, I can make things better, I am the one who is and does all of these things, then when we're challenged by circumstance and we don't know how to proceed, there's a corresponding sense of loss in our sense of who we are. And this comes up increasingly in my work with senior leaders facing unprecedented levels of uncertainty, is they often talk about their energy can become quite flat and depressed, and they often bring in existential questions about, if I'm not the one who can do, then who am I? So in terms of developing leaders and coaching to develop leaders, from this perspective, it requires us to be able to enable and facilitate movement and expansion in our coachees from being in the grip of neurotic anxiety to learning to bear existential anxiety and to expand where possible their sense of a fixed identity to actually making friends with identity as something that's much more fluid and that changes moment by moment. That in turn supports us to be able to respond more creatively in the moment. Very briefly, those of you who know me will know this is a particular area of research and interest of mine. Brief mention of narcissism and shame. These are psychological processes which really exacerbate our responses to not knowing and uncertainty, the negative ones. Partly because of what I've said about we identify with our self-images. And I think two self-images that are very important in the context of coaching and consulting in organizations are the self-images or the ego ideals, those images that we strive to be, of omnipotence and omniscience. So omnipotence is the belief that I can do it all, and I can do everything that I need to do and that I'm challenged by, and everything that the corporation needs to be successful and meet its strategic objectives. But perhaps more accurately, it's the ideal that I aspire to. So it's a belief that I should be able to do that, even if I can't. And omniscience is the belief that I should know everything. I should have all the facts and all the solutions at my fingertips, and therefore not knowing, being uncertain, threatens the pursuit of those ego ideals, which are reinforced in organizations that actively privilege and reward the lonely heroes who do extraordinary things in the face, against all the odds, in spite of paying a huge price in terms of health and mental health and possibly family life. But this is what we tend to still privilege and reinforce. So shame is one way of thinking about shame. It's by no means the only way, is the experience that we have when we perceive or are actually failing to live up to our own individual and organizational ideals. And it leads us through the action of the inner critic, or what Freud called the superego, the inner critic that's observing how we're doing against our ideals. And if we're failing in some way, is telling us that we're deficient, that we haven't got what it takes. This is at the heart of imposter syndrome for those of you who are interested in that. And again, through a process of identification, where we identify with the content of our minds, for many of our clients, and certainly for me for many years, I couldn't differentiate between the thought, you are deficient, and actually taking myself to be deficient. And that distinction between the thought and identifying with the thought can be very useful to be holding in mind with our clients. So this is another way of talking about the same thing. When things are going well for our clients and we can take some satisfaction because everything we're doing seems to be working out, and often more by luck than by design, we can reinforce those images of knowing everything I need to know and being able to do everything I turn my hand to. The problem is when complexity, uncertainty increases in our sphere and our sphere of influence decreases and control decreases. And more often than not, the initial response is to collapse into the opposite of omnipotence, which is feelings of impotence, a loss of power, a loss of control, a loss of an ability to think, fueled by the superego's attacks, the attacks of the inner critic, confirming and telling us that we are lacking in some way and that everybody else has got what it takes, but not us. I wanted to show on this slide, it's very connected to everything I've been talking to, but I wanted to describe a movement that I often have seen in my clients, moving from a state of safe certainty. This is based on Mason's work, who is doing a lot of work in social work with social workers working in the area of child protection. Essentially, safe certainty refers to our state whereby we associate feeling psychologically safe, in light of what I've been talking to, coherent in our sense of identity. And we associate those feelings with certainty, with that which we know, with that which we can predict, and with that which we believe we have control over. And in order to move to a state where we can actually feel relatively safe in uncertainty, the following processes seem to occur to varying degrees and with varying degrees of overtness in the people that we work with. The first is that something happens, and the current pandemic is full of examples of that. Something happens which shakes our reliance on the imagined certainty, the simplification that Campanole talks about in the quote that I began with. So certainty starts to become a bit paler, as has happened as I'm trying to show in my graphic, which I was very proud of when it occurred to me. So certainty becomes less solid, I think, is another way of saying it. So we start to get a whiff that things aren't quite as clear, as certain, or as predictable as we might like to think they are for our own sense of safety. This, of course, starts to feel unsafe. We start to feel anxious. We start to experience neurotic anxiety. And at this stage, typical behavior includes that doing more of the same, and hoping that that will somehow support us and restore a sense of control. But its effect is unsafe because it often leads to a whole host of negative and unintended consequences. I'm thinking here particularly of panic buying that certainly in the UK we saw when lockdown in the current crisis first happened, that there was a rush to stockpile certain food items and also toilet roll. I have some theories about that, but now isn't the time to go into that. But essentially, one way to think about this is that this behavior, so the purchasing of the toilet roll was not actually what was happening psychologically. What was being purchased, or what was being attempted to be purchased, was reassurance and a restoration of feeling secure in habit and familiarity. The next stage in the process of moving from safe certainty to safe uncertainty really involves feeling and experiencing directly the loss of certainty. And that will often feel very disorienting and very challenging to any of us and to our clients, particularly if they are still in the grip of ego ideals around having to know, having to be in control. But it's only by being able to have the direct experience of the state of anxiety, hopefully well contained, and I'll come on to this in a second, by the coach, that our clients can learn to integrate, to make part of their repertoire of experience the experience of not knowing. Unless they can do this, chances are they will remain in the bottom two quadrants on this model, lurching between safe certainty and unsafe certainty. And defense mechanisms like denial and repression, of which there is plenty to be observed in the world right now, will continue to operate. So being able to experience the degree of unsafety we feel in the face of the reality of uncertainty starts the process of converting neurotic anxiety, the pursuit of control, to existential anxiety, the ability to tolerate, to bear, to sit with not knowing in order to continue to make sense of what is unprecedented in our lives, hitherto something we've never experienced before. And so we restore agency in our clients and in ourselves if we can learn to contain and bear the existential anxiety and rediscover our capacity to think, to create, to innovate, to relate to one another, to work things out together. And it's that process that leads us to then developing a capacity to feel safe, or at least safe enough and trusting in our capabilities, even when we feel we can't control what's happening around us. So to put that in the context of ego ideals, the resolution of lurching between omnipotence when everything's going well and impotence when we're challenged. When we're in an omnipotent state, which is a state of mind, it's disconnected from reality, we get to experience creativity and imagination. And my favorite example of this is, and I'm sure many of you will have had this, is in our minds we can do anything, including flying, those wonderful dreams that some of us can have if we're lucky, of being free as a bird and flying. However, if when we woke up we were to jump out of a first floor window, it wouldn't end particularly well. And that's because, in addition to the imagination and the omnipotence in our minds, there is a reality, in this case gravity, which limits our omnipotence in our minds. But from that experience of impotence, of there being limits, we get to realize that part of living as adults in complexity is to get into a relationship with inevitable limitation. Very difficult for coaches and leaders who might be very identified with being the expert or the one who knows. And if we can hold on to our capacity for creativity whilst also experiencing limitation, when we're lurching between omnipotence and impotence, creativity and limitation are split. So omnipotence is creativity without limitation, and impotence is limitation without creativity. If we can integrate both of those perspectives, then we can achieve what Laurent Lapierre calls a state of relative potency. We start to experience ourselves as being able to remain creative and thoughtful, even when limitation is tightly confining possibilities. But actually, within those constraints that we can do nothing about, we are completely free to dream of flying. And then see what of those dreams might enable us to adjust more creatively to the situation that we're in. Just checking time. And it's worth saying that from a psychoanalytic perspective, the process of giving up our omnipotent fantasies is a process of mourning. So often our clients will experience flatness of energy, a sense of loss, disorientation, the sorts of things that we experience when we're bereaved. So I wanted to, again, a lot of words here, again, just check your own levels of attention and whether you are a bit overwhelmed right now, and if so, feel free to close your eyes. But at Ashridge, our primary area of interest and research and application is in the context of relational coaching and what it means and what it has to offer us. And here are some of the things that I think make a relational approach particularly suited to working with levels of uncertainty and complexity. From a relational perspective, we implicitly see that the meaning that we hold moment by moment is constantly being socially constructed in dialogue with the coach and between the coach and the coachee, and between the coachee and their stakeholders. And this helps to support implicitly a relaxation of being overly attached to predetermined and fixed ideas or pseudo-certainties or positions. It's quite a nice exercise at the moment when you're watching the news, is to just look out for those politicians or commentators who are more wedded to position, as opposed to those who can talk about positions being a little bit more fluid. A relational approach to practice actively makes use of the dynamics in the relationship between the coach and the coachee to meet relational needs. For example, all of our needs that we have for support. It helps to contain anxiety in the face of not knowing and when our identities are shifting. So the coach is a sort of an auxiliary cortex. If the client's amygdala has hijacked the ability for the client to think, the coach can help to soothe and regulate the client just through the quality of their presence and their own ability to regulate their own anxiety. From Gestalt, I'm a Gestalt therapist by training, we see the self not as a fixed or static thing, but a dynamic process. So we can pay attention with our clients to how are you being impacted moment by moment by your experiences of uncertainty? How are your attachments to beliefs about what you should be able to do affecting you right now? What happens if you let those go in terms of your ability to think? Again, something I import from Gestalt is the idea that health and well-being and effectiveness and optimal responsiveness in organizations are predicated on our ability to, moment by moment, respond creatively rather than try and graft on pre-existing knowledge and best practice. Best practice really, if you think about it, can only ever be yesterday's practice. It's what worked back then over there. Most of our clients are faced with something that is very challenging right here, right now. And what worked back there and back then won't necessarily be the right thing. So working relationally, supporting meaning making, and learning in a dialogic relationship means that the coach acts as a thinking partner and a source of novelty. So this is what we mean by use of, one of the things we mean by use of self as instrument. The coach doesn't stick rigidly to a protocol, but the coach tracks closely how he or she is experiencing him or herself in relation with the client, and treats their experience, their countertransference in a psychoanalytic sense, as being full of information about them, about their client, and about the context and how they're both being impacted by it and the relationship. And those experiences, the more we can tune into these subtle experiences, provides us with a wealth of information. Just because they're subtle doesn't mean they're not full of information about what's going on and what might be needed. And ultimately, working relationally is about human to human, subject to subject connection. It normalizes being human. It welcomes the ordinariness of human experience, of human vulnerability and personal challenge. And it acts as an antidote to those fantasies of omnipotence and the lonely hero archetype. I think I'm going to make this our final slide so that there's time for any of you who want to respond or ask questions to do so. I thought I should do this because it's quite helpful to try and distill. There's a lot in what I've said, but as a way of just remembering the tasks, if we wanted to talk in that sort of language, of helping our clients in uncertainty. First thing is to normalize any disorientation and fear. And we do that by being willing to witness exactly where the client is, by understanding, being willing to understand, and to attune, to let our bodies be impacted in an empathic way by the experience of our clients without judgment, and accepting and allowing neurotic anxiety. Those of us, and I certainly have been one of those, and for many years was one of those of us who have our own neurotic anxiety around being seen to be highly competent and a coach who gets good results, can struggle with accepting our own anxiety and therefore struggle in accepting our clients' anxiety. And we can resort to getting busy, to exerting subtle and not so subtle pressures to try and encourage and nudge the client towards a solution. But at a deeper level of limbic resonance, any anxiety in ourself will be communicated to the client, whether they're conscious of it or not. And it can imply a subtle judgment. It's not okay for you to be so anxious. We need to change that, rather than let's contain it and explore it and see what emerges. So the next thing that we need to be paying attention to is containing anxiety, helping the client to resource themselves, helping them to learn how to regulate their amygdala, their nervous system, and that restores the capacity for reflection and meaning making. Having normalized and contained, of course, this doesn't happen in a linear way, as Kompanola would support. These processes, these stages or these orientations are happening all the time and moving all the time. So 1 minute we're normalizing, then we might be containing. Then if the client is feeling a moment of containment, we can focus on the question, what is this situation that I've never experienced before, calling for me to learn and discover? That becomes the seed of development and learning. And this restores for our clients their sense of agency and control in the form of, I don't know what to do, but I do know how to think. And with the support of my coach, I learn that I can think things through, try things out, discover new responses in myself and new strategies in my organization. And another element here is building support for experimentation. Often our clients are working in environments that are in the grip of neurotic anxiety. So if they've been doing work to expand their perspective with us as coaches, they will need support to act from those expanded perspectives. And the coach can become an evoked companion. This is Daniel Stern's idea from developmental psychology, that we form internal images of people who we experience as supportive and as being our allies. So even when the client is out in the world on their own, having to think on their feet, their experience of their coach and the coaching, they can remember it, they can dream it up in the moment of being in a meeting or having to give a presentation or deliver bad news. And that will help to regulate their nervous system without the coach being there. So just to summarize, normalize, contain, focus, and build support. I'm going to stop there. I could go on to talk about what this requires for us as coaches, but let's, from us as coaches, let's pause there, because I'd really love to just hear from those of you who are here, who might have questions. We won't be able to get through them all, but let's let's see if we can get a bit more relational. I'm going to stop the share and see what happens. So, Simon, are you there?
I am indeed. We have a question from Stefan. Just going to allow him to talk now.
Okay, that's lovely. Oh, Stefan.
Hello.
Hi, Stefan.
Hi. Good afternoon. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for your inspiring presentation. Right this morning, I had a conversation with one of my most important clients, HR director of a hospitality company. And that company has a strong doing culture. And she hardly experienced her doing more of the same as a problem. And somehow in that sense, the idea of omnipotence or omniscientness seemed to strongly being activated in her coping style with reality. And I tried to lightly bring this to the table and attach it to a mutual understanding of the culture at stake in that company. And but somehow it seemed to frighten her as well. And I brought that to the table, and I wonder, was I too early, and I'm sure I did it lightly, and it was also at the end of the conversation, so I think there was containment. But I wonder what your ideas are about such a situation that we can presume there is something with the business culture and the personal coping style, which is very relevant and related to your theme of omniscient and omnipotence, and by that, not that productive.
Yeah, there's a lot in what you're saying, Stefan. It's a really lovely example of the difference between theoretical abstraction, which is what I've been talking about, ideas about, and what actually happens in the dynamism and the uniqueness of our moment by moment relationship with our clients. So, I mean, a couple of thoughts there. First of all, I really appreciate your self-supervision, the way you're asking yourself, might I have been a bit quick, or what was going on there? Because that's really how we practice safe uncertainty, is by staying reflective and really paying attention to what's happening between us and our clients. One way to think about this is that, and you will know as a relational coach, which I know you to be, that the way we think about interventions from a relational perspective is that we offer something, we offer a perspective or a thought in the way you did with your client, in a light touch way. And we don't presume to know what the effect of that will be, because we can't, because these are two subjectivities in relationship. But what happens next is full of information. So you sensed, or she may have been explicit, that she became slightly anxious and threatened when you were trying to normalize. So one way we might think about this is that that's information about how attached at the moment the client is to her ideas of omnipotence and control. And that the idea of relaxing that attachment is quite threatening to her sense of her coherence. So the first thing to do is to drop that strategy, because it's only by responding in a way that is tuning into where the client is that we stand to create the possibility for support in the client to develop. So your willingness to drop it could be very important. Our willingness to drop our agenda or our hypothesis. And don't underestimate the power of your presence as a coach, which is on one of the slides I was going to talk about, but we didn't have time. Remember that we are impacting our clients, according to the Boston Change Process Study Group, who've done a lot of research in this area, at two levels. The explicit level, the words we use, the concepts we introduce, the narrative, and that's explicit between us. But we are also profoundly impacting one another at the implicit level, at the level of how it feels to be with one another in the moment. So just because you might have to drop that explicit line of inquiry because the client is getting a bit activated in their nervous system, don't underestimate the power of the client's experience of you being respectful, of slowing down, of taking a different tack, of staying very present in yourself. The client's nervous system is going to be picking that up, and that will help to regulate.
Yeah.
Right? As much as, in fact, that will regulate more often than the words and the concepts. So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it surely helps. To give you some information, what happened next was that she looked very thoughtful after my words, and I was not speeding up. I was really slow.
Nice.
And then she looked very thoughtful, and she said, yeah, perhaps we come back on that, huh? So I when you were talking, I had to remember your words. Nothing is wasted, or
Yeah. Everything is potentially relevant.
So this really helps, and it's good to reflect further on it.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you, Stefan. That was a great example.
Thank you.
Hi, Simon. Brijesh here. Can you hear me?
I can, Brijesh. Hello, nice to meet you.
Thank you, Simon. First of all, having moved from London to South Africa in December, I can't help but get distracted by your background. I am missing London big time.
Fill your boots, Brijesh.
Thank you. I am missing that, but the South African sun is doing. Thank you for the presentation, Simon. What I wanted to ask you was your thoughts on, like you mentioned, that the shifting sands were happening and they got accelerated in this COVID times. Similarly, some of the work which I'm doing research on is around impact of digitalization on executive coaching and executive coaches. And again, something which was happening, but has kind of got accelerated in this COVID time. Interesting to hear, would be interested to know your thoughts on how this acceleration of digitalization impacting the world of executive coaching, or would impact. Thank you.
Well, I suppose the word that you'd expect sort of leaps out at me is more the relational, the impact on the relational aspect of executive coaching. I find that at the explicit level that I was talking to Stefan about, oh, by the way, I'm not an expert in this area of digitalization. I'm sure your research will be far richer than I could possibly be talking to. Experience. And one of the things that I'm finding is that, going back to that idea of there are two levels of relational interaction happening: explicit, which is cognitive, conscious, explicit and visible, and the implicit. I'm finding that where there is, that the explicit works fine, because often the digital takes us more into our thinking. But what I'm noticing is I have to be far more intentional in how I manage my own state, to stay present and embodied, feeling the ground beneath my feet, so that I can pick up more of the subtlety that I was talking to Stefan about. So in terms of where does this go, I don't know. Like you, I'm curious because it's early days. And I'm very interested in how to bring more of a relational orientation into the virtual space. And I've been part of a spiritual school for many years now, and we do a lot of, have been doing a lot of meditation and large group work online. And what I've noticed is when you have many people around the planet tuning into their feelings, it's palpable, even if you're literally in a different country. So I don't know where we're going. and where this might lead, but I'm really curious and open to discovering how to work relationally in the virtual space.
And it's really interesting. You make the mention of the mindfulness work and the mindful apps and the online mindful, and then tomorrow being one of the global meditation practices for me. Looking forward to doing it first time. Any thoughts on coaching by the bots? Really pushing the envelope even further. Not only virtual, but the apps and the AI-led work that is happening?
It's not an area that I have a lot of experience in. I mean, my view, Brajesh, is everything has potential, but every application, every approach will have something to offer, and it will also have limitations. And I have to declare my bias. Why I'm so interested in relational ideas is because, for me, relationality is a very integrative orientation. It includes the possibility of everything. Personally, I wouldn't want to rely alone on digitization and apps, because they can only really appeal to cognitive processing, not the processing that happens when we're resonating heart to heart and body to body energetically, which is it's a hugely important part of our ability to integrate learning, to mentalize from our experience. But because I'm not a specialist or an expert in that area, I don't know what's out there, so I can't really say more than that.
Thanks for the thought, Simon. Don't want to take this further. If you're okay, and if you have your permission, can I reach out to you for some thoughts and exploration?
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. You can get my email from Caroline, whose email you have.
Thanks, Simon.
Okay. I don't know how we're doing for time. Have we got time for one more?
Yes, I've just popped Anita on. I think it's 5-2 now.
This will probably have to be our last one.
That's
Anita, hello.
fine. Simon, thank you so much. That's an absolutely brilliant session. And Brajesh, nice to hear your voice. So Brajesh,
I don't know that he can reply, Anita. I think he's muted.
Okay, Brajesh and I work in the same organization, and so just nice to hear his voice. As Brajesh has just said, Simon, it'd be really great to pick up with you after this session. There's a particular point that you've made on personhood, which I think is an absolutely brilliant concept. And I'm thinking, how can we explore that further in the context of leadership specifically?
Right. Wonderful question. And I have to say, it's not my word. It's this is my inner critic has an opinion about this. I should have said that's a word that I've taken from John Heron, who's written extensively about the human condition. So John Heron's personhood concept. I'm glad you're making use of it. Absolutely. I think we're probably going to have
very much indeed. We can pick up from you separately. Thank you.
Yeah. Good.
I think we might have time for one more question.
Okay, one more question then. This will be the last one, I'm sure, because Caroline, you have to say a few things, I think.
There is a question here from Lynn about how do people in senior executive roles, whose role is to achieve company objective, truly hold that space with colleagues to support creativity if this will digress from company goals?
Company norms?
Goals.
Oh. Well, this is a huge area. It's the area that I spend a lot of time working in as a consultant. Part of the constellation that I've been talking to of being identified with omnipotent fantasies, with seeing leadership as being about doing and getting things done, inclines many individuals and their systems to really value doing and to subtly and not so subtly devalue space for relationship, connection, thinking together, exploration, contact, all the sorts of things that we know from all of the research into relational practice make a real difference to people's sense of who they are and people's ability to do good work together. So it's a challenge. And one of the things that we as coaches have to be prepared to do in introducing these ideas is be willing to question gently the norms and the structures and the cultural patterning in the organizations that might actually be detrimental to the organization's effectiveness. And that dilemma is also what our leaders face if, in the context of coaching, they start to recognize the value of working in this way. And then this is what I mean by building support for experimentation. It's a huge area. I haven't done it justice, but I can see the time. So I'm going to shut up now and hand over to you, Caroline.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. This was very insightful. I would like also to say thank you very much to everybody who's joined us today, and I hope you found this session thought-provoking. If you want to find out more about our next events, then please do visit our website or get in touch with me. Feel free to send me an email if you've got any question about Ashridge